We live in an information age, but that age is also rampant with misinformation, that is, false or inaccurate information. As we all know, misinformation circulates widely across the internet and beyond. And it's coupled with disinformation, a more sinister manifestation that is false information deliberately intended to mislead. Misinformation has been weaponized. The world has become a minefield of false facts manipulating people into real-world consequences. Working in this minefield, journalists have a more difficult and important job than ever. Falsehoods and engineered and manipulated content are everywhere, and reporters work as best they can to expose and disarm it with the best tools at their disposal: research, context, and technology. I'm Michael Depp, editor of TVNewsCheck, and this is Inside the Media, the show that looks at the business of the news and the people who make it. This week, we're looking at misinformation and disinformation, and how news media, with some critical help from technology companies, are battling both. My guests this week are on the front lines of the battle against misinformation and disinformation. Jonathan Forsythe is the managing editor of VERIFY, a reporting project that solicits direct questions from audiences about the veracity of information they encounter. VERIFY is based within the US television station group Tegna. Bruce MacCormack is the co-lead of Project Origin, a consortium of media and technology companies including the New York Times, BBC, CBC Radio-Canada, and Microsoft. Pia Blumenthal is lead product designer for Adobe's Content Authenticity Initiative and co-chair for the C2PA UX Task Force. She'll be unpacking what that means shortly. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan, Canadians may not be familiar with VERIFY, so can you briefly explain how it all works?
Sure. VERIFY, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, Michael. VERIFY is a news organization owned by Tegna, but at its core, it's about identifying true and false information for audiences across the globe, but especially in the US. We are answering audience questions as a priority. We cite sources as a format. We cite them before we get into the answer so that the audience has a sense of the transparency in the way that we arrive at the research to find the answer. And our work appears across linear, the broadcast channels of the 50+ stations that make up Tegna, local TV stations across the US, in addition to their websites and our other platforms, including newsletter, Snapchat, YouTube, all the digital social media platforms as well.
So widely available. What are some of the more common inquiries that you're getting these days where misinformation tends to be at play?
Well, it follows the news cycle a lot, as you won't be surprised to hear. There's a lot of questions about the footage and the claims that are coming out of Ukraine currently. It kind of runs the gamut. Gas prices and other some of the trickle-down impacts of what's happening in Ukraine are also, and how they're impacting people's wallets in the US. Those are, the majority of the questions we're getting, in addition to new variants as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic.
You haven't mentioned that yet.
Well, that's taken a back seat since Ukraine broke out. But as the new subvariants are coming out, there's still a lot of questions about those. How transmissible are they? Are the old vaccines useful in protection against those? And there's a lot of these questions we just don't have answers to yet. But there's a lot of those questions that we're getting.
Okay. Bruce, disinformation has gotten to be a wickedly sophisticated game. Who are some of the kinds of bad actors who are out there deliberately spreading false information?
I think you can probably break them into three broad categories. And these are very broad and they bleed into each other. Some people are going to be in all three. But you can take a look at the ego actors, the old hacker community that gets credit, and there's a currency in that community for having pulled one off and fooled the mainstream media and gotten something through. There is a commercial component. There's a lot of misinformation that is driven by fraud or drives to drive fraud, specifically ad fraud, click-throughs, and people actually because every time you click on an ad, someone gets paid for showing that to you. And if you can convince a legitimate ad to pay an illegitimate actor to show it to you, they're making money. So there's a commercial fraud component. And there's a political component of it too, that, as you said, tends to follow the news cycles and is flown where you see topical things, whether it was election fraud or Brexit, or moving towards COVID or through COVID and towards climate change, which is the next growing big area. There's political motivation behind that, and they're trying to make a point or to influence the conversation.
Does political tend to dominate the triad there?
I don't know. I think it depends on who you are, because a lot of some of it's targeted. So it'll depend on your profile as a receiver of the content, and it will depend on the seasonality of what's going on.
So Pia, paint a picture for us of some of the tools that these bad actors are using to create and then to disseminate information.
Sure. Well, there's really a spectrum of ways mis and disinformation can be spread. On the simple end, there's basic misattribution and miscontextualization, like resharing a photo taken years earlier to represent something current. This happens accidentally, but it can, of course, be intentional. There are cheap fakes or shallow fakes, which are simple edits to images and video, often made with easy to access editing tools like Photoshop. And an example is this time from a political version, a video of Nancy Pelosi from a couple years ago that was just slowed down to give the appearance that she was slurring her words. So cheap fakes are often easy to spot and debunk, but unfortunately they're very effective at spreading misinformation when shared at scale across social media. And then on the other end, there are AI manipulations and deep fakes, which are synthetic media used to replace existing people, places, or things, or to generate new versions entirely from scratch. These are tools that aren't inherently bad and in fact can be used for very cool and creative purposes. Just last week, there was an announcement around DALL-E 2, which is a new tool to create realistic images and art just using search terms. So you could type in a sentence like, show me an astronaut riding a horse in space, and then see a very realistic rendering. But on the flip side, another recent political example is a piece of disinformation, a deepfake video of President Zelensky, who was manipulated to tell his troops to lay down their weapons. So of course, AI manipulations and generated content are just generally becoming a lot more sophisticated and realistic. So you can really imagine that in the hands of bad actors, these can absolutely be weaponized for disinformation campaigns.
Yeah, these tools seem to be iterating constantly, and great leaps and bounds of sophisticatedness. And of course, we just mentioned Zelensky. There's so much around the war in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, that we've seen just in the last weeks or 6 weeks or so. That's remarkable. Bruce, where are people most likely to encounter misinformation and disinformation? I'm pretty sure you're going to say social media as at least part of your answer. So if you could elaborate on the platform or the context as specifically as possible.
Yeah, you're right. Social media platforms are probably, it's where people are going, so it's where they're going to interact with the content. The difference, I think, yes, to contrast a social media platform, which is transmitting content either from professional journalistic organizations or from people, just person to person, versus a media organization who has a journalistic mandate and ethics and all that they have to constrain themselves to. If you go to the BBC website, you're going to see BBC content. It's going to come with the quality level of the BBC. If you go to a Facebook or a Twitter, you're going to see information coming from your friends and neighbors and cousins who may work for the BBC, but probably don't. And it will come with the level of something they found out about, heard, third-hand information. So you're getting the broken telephone chain happening there. Could be. It could be legitimate information. Hey, I saw this stuff from the BBC. It could be something that said, hey, this says it's from CNN, but you actually have no absolute security that it really is a CNN story when you see it not on the CNN website. It could be something purporting to be CNN. And misrepresentation of brands is a huge problem because all of the credibility of the brand then transmits through so that you want to believe it, but it's someone that's just stuck a CNN logo on something they've created using one of the tools Pia was talking about. You can't believe your eyes anymore. We used to say seeing is believing. Well, seeing is no longer believing. So you need something else. So where you're seeing it starts to become one of the tools. And there, it's you're not even sure that, you know, the like I said, if you go to the source, if you buy a Gucci bag at a Gucci store, you get a Gucci bag. If you buy a Gucci bag on Canal Street, might not be real.
Right,
So I
exactly.
guess that's how and social media is the Canal Street of news.
Are the platforms in your assessment sufficiently trying to counteract these actions? Have they devoted significant or sufficient resources to the problem?
Yeah, I mean, they're private companies. They do their own thing, and they do their own thing quite often inside a black box. So it's hard to comment on that authoritatively. I can say that their motivation is engagement, right? The more eyeballs watching the more stuff, the better off they are commercially. And more stuff doesn't necessarily have to be, well, it can be anything really. It's more. And the challenge that legitimate organizations, that professional media organizations have is they tend to be constrained by facts. We're storytellers, right? We want to tell stories. And if you have to tell your story constrained by facts, your story will be slightly less sexy than a story that can be told unconstrained by facts. As a result, you can tell really great stories about, you know, the Loch Ness Monster and all sorts of things that you want to go ahead and tell a story about, and it will get more audience and it will get more engagement because it's a more interesting story. It's just not true. Right, and that's the dynamic that we're dealing with right now. But the volume is something that the platforms want, constrained by the various forms of regulation and social pressure that they're under.
Jonathan, your job involves dealing with this problem day in, day out with Tegna newsrooms across the country, as well as your national team in the States. How bad has this problem of misinformation and disinformation become in the course of you doing this work?
I mean, it's ubiquitous. It gives us plenty of work to do, but it's across the board. I'll go back to one of the things that Pia was mentioning, the different forms that you find it. One example that our team recently worked on is the Zelensky deepfake. We did a version of that, and we actually, one of the things that my team has, we have video editors, motion graphics producers, animators, in addition to researchers and digital journalists. And we are able to illustrate the process a little bit differently than some other fact-checking organizations, which of course lends itself to our broadcast news product, but also our digital space. And so we were able to show how we used InVid and TinEye to actually identify the different frames and how the deepfake of Zelensky was produced, and kind of walked the viewer through our process, which I think lends to some of that transparency that we really try to get at. But we also, on the flip side, had a story that we did a couple months prior, which was of the California Governor Gavin Newsom. A deepfake had been created of him purportedly making a public speech after receiving one of the COVID vaccines, a booster shot. And it was edited in a way that made it look like he had partial facial paralysis. And this was being shared. And originally, we had a conversation editorially within the group is, this is intentional, it's a joke, this is not something that people really believe is true. But then we realized that this had spread in a lot of the anti-vax community and across some of these social platforms. So we decided to do a story on it. We went through and did the story and very simply found the original video from Gavin Newsom's Twitter feed that it was clearly ripped off from and then manipulated, and walked the viewers through that process. The original poster eventually took down his video and said it was just a joke. So that's like a perfect example of just how prominent and ubiquitous this is across the board, even from people who aren't intending to be bad actors. They do something as a joke, as a quote unquote joke, but that could turn into something that could be weaponized, that could be used to spread further misinformation and doubt in some of the health practices across the country. So It really runs the gamut. It's across the board. And, the platforms to back up what Bruce is saying, I believe that they are also trying to do their best here. They're not necessarily the bad guys, even though they could do a lot more. I think a lot of that, we're figuring out, but we're always going to be a step behind the bad actors who are intending to do that. And some of that is, selfishly, I would love for them to sort of amplify a little bit more of some of the work that teams like mine are doing to write and sort of prove, what is true and what is false. And they're getting there, but it's just going to take time.
Maybe they could stand to be telling their story a little bit better about what they're doing internally instead of being maybe as opaque as they are about it. What's interesting is that paralysis seems to be a common thread that's emerging here of the kind of fake constructions that people are devising. So I think we've laid out sort of the nut and the scope of the problem. Let's look at what news media have at their disposal to fight back against it. So Jonathan, tell us how you triage potentially bad information that comes across your threshold. What first tools do you use? And then how do you escalate something?
Sure. So we use a project management software called Notion, very straightforward. We do our best to answer as many audience questions as possible because we're not coming at this from a political lens as much as we're trying to be a utility and something that is that our audience can relate to. So we can answer questions that run the gamut. So it's not just sort of through one particular grouping. So we accept questions through we have a text line, we have email, we have obviously all of our social channels where we get comments, and then we'll bring the ones in that are starting to, we see multiples of, and we'll prioritize those because that's when we reach, we realize there's a tipping point. Also, we're monitoring the news cycle. So we know when there's multiple questions coming in different venues that we're going to go ahead and assign to a researcher. But for us, it's really about, smart news judgment. It's about patience. It's about not amplifying misinformation in a way that might be harmful and being careful about how you're writing your headlines. It's about taking the additional step to show the process, which I know that news organizations are reluctant to do because they have a tight window and they don't have the time to kind of show their work. And that's one of the things I think has made our format somewhat successful and unique is that, as I mentioned previous, we mention our sources at the very top so that the audience knows where we got our information from before we tell them how we got it and what the answer is. I think news organizations can take another step in that direction. It's not about putting it on necessarily on the 6 o'clock news or in that A1 story, but you might have additional elements in social or digital channels that you could have the full interview with an expert, for example, so that there's more transparency in case people are wondering, oh, they're just picking and choosing quotes or they're manipulating. No, here's something else that can show some transparency so that everybody, we have our cards on the table. So those are just a couple of initial steps.
Pia, you and Bruce are part of a consortium or multiple consortia working on developing ways of authenticating a piece of news content and marking how it may be handled or changes it moves along the chain and is published or republished across the internet. So I think this is a good time to briefly explain what the Content Authenticity Initiative and the C2PA UX Task Force are.
Sure. So, well, actually, I'll start with the C2PA, which is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is an open digital provenance technical standards committee. And so the Content Authenticity Initiative that I'm part of is really the advocacy and education arm that's building on top of the C2PA standard. So I'll just start by defining what provenance is. This is the basic set of trustworthy facts about the origin of a piece of digital content like images, video, or audio. Basically, where something came from and what happened to it along the way. And we refer to these details as metadata assertions. So the who, what, where, and when. To ensure verifiability and reliability, they are hashed or securely bound to the content and then signed by a trusted authority who is essentially taking responsibility for the verification. And we call this extra layer of secure metadata content credentials. So as part of the C2PA UX task force, we have to think about what the actual user experience is of interacting with provenance data out in the wild. There's really two parts. There's the creator side, wherein a producer generates a piece of content and then decides what assertion data they want to include, like information about their identity. Then there's the consumer side, which is where we think most people will actually interact with content credentials down the line. And so for this, we're really designing several different levels of progressive disclosure, meaning the way that people actually interact and come across provenance data.
So when these tools on the content creator side, as these tools are becoming available, they're just sort of included in software updates?
That's what we're hoping for, that this is really just an augmentation of provenance data that is embedded into existing workflows. So it just becomes a natural part of the content creation and editing and publishing processes.
Bruce, I mentioned earlier that the New York Times, BBC, and CBC Radio Canada are part of the Project Origin effort. Maybe you could just sort of explain first what Project Origin is as a sort of adjunct to what Pia just explained.
Sure. Well, CAI and Project Origin were two initiatives that were running in parallel with basically the same idea. Project Origin said, we need to work on how to protect video and how does it get from the station to the television, basically. That was what we were worried about. And we started chatting with our friends at Adobe, and they said, we're worried about photos and we're worried about how it gets from the camera into the newsroom. And we went, okay, well, ultimately we've got to solve the problem from the camera to the television or to the screen of some form. And we need one method to go end to end and protect this. We talked about it as the Tylenol safety seal for news, but it's also the Tylenol safety seal for a security camera. It's also the Tylenol safety seal for a body camera with a policeman. It's also the Tylenol safety seal for a drone when you're using it in the military. So there was a much broader problem to solve. And we said, the last thing we need to have is lots of standards, right? One would be nice. So we all said, let's get together and work on this as an industry. And we were joined by Nikon, and we were joined by Intel, and all, Canon and Sony. So these companies are coming together and working to build one standard. And that's the work that Pia's been doing. Project Origin says, okay, let's focus back on the news. What does this mean to reporters? And reporters don't want to know about metadata and all this stuff. The most important thing Pia said is it doesn't change the workflow. I mean, I do my job doesn't change, the tool does it for me. And that's really what we're starting to work through. So the CBC, the BBC, and the New York Times had the resources to say, look, we think we can at least start the conversation. But it's an open conversation. We're reaching out to other news organizations and we're saying, look, this is an open standard. It's coming. The tool vendors that are going to make the things we use are going to be doing it. Let's talk about what this means to the craft of journalism and how are we going to use this in our day-to-day job. And that's really what Project Origin's been focused on.
So even when these provenance authentication tools get into more hands, you've got a problem of escalation, which we've raised before. So Pia, how do you keep up with the bad guys? Can you even, or are they always one step ahead?
Yeah, I would say it's for our approach, it's less about keeping up or catching the bad guys. Instead, we want to proactively provide data transparency and therefore engender more trust in content that people come across online. And I think we really believe in what we refer to as the virtuous cycle, which is that as more news platforms and social feeds and internet companies adopt provenance tools, the absence of that data will become a signal for questioning trustworthiness.
So we've been talking a lot about bad actors, deliberately deceptive actions here, but what about the very common problem of just regular people passing along some false information that they got from their uncle on Facebook or Twitter? Can any of you can weigh in if you like here, but what are some of the best technologies or simply the best practices that you would point to now to try to curb that problem?
That's an education problem, right? As much as anything else. We use the word amplification a couple of times today. Every time you send something to 10 other people, you've amplified a story. So if you don't think before you amplify, you're a litterer. You're going to the public information space and you're a littering. And we need to damp that down through behavioral changes, telling people, think before you click, right? Why do you know this is true? Again, just questioning and and gentle skepticism. Like, we don't want to say don't believe anything, because there's a lot of stuff that is true, but gentle skepticism that says, I wonder why. Is there a provenance symbol on that says it's coming from a trusted source? Do I trust that source? Yes. Okay, now share it. But you don't see that. As Pia said, ask why it's not there. Why is the symbol not there? Becomes the little bit of things we want people to start thinking about.
Jonathan, I'm going to give you the last word. One of the things that I've admired about VERIFY is the transparency that's built into its DNA. You take viewers and readers through the whole process by which you're working to verify the claim or the information that you've received. How do you think that this approach can be more widely adapted to everyday news reporting to help build trust with audiences and to be more proactive about stamping out misinformation? You started to talk to this earlier, but I wonder if you can elaborate on how in a newscast we might just see a little bit more of the process in the product.
Yeah, I would start with committing to showing, not telling, or showing and telling, right? Trying to illustrate the process a little bit more, making a commitment for that, I think will go a long way. And I actually recently read an Adobe trust report, which there were a few things in that really resonated with me as it related to the digital economy and how personal it is, right? A couple key takeaways for me, and as we apply it to what we do at VERIFY and prioritizing answering audience questions. And I know every news organization does that to some degree, right? But it's a matter of how much prioritization they put on it, how many resources they have. It can be a loser's game to try to keep up with comments on threads in certain platforms and that sort of thing. But a couple of takeaways from that Adobe Trust report. One, personalization is a trust multiplier. Two, personalized content inspires trust. And three, consumers put their money where their trust is. And for us, it's easier for a relative startup organization like ours. I will grant that, as we are just getting started in this space. But we have prioritized not only answering audience questions, but making sure to follow up with the folks who send in a question when we don't have an answer, or we can't verify it for some reason, or we are working on it. And I think those little elements go a long way to building that trust, in addition to our process of illustrating and showing the process and listing our sources at the top, so that our audience really has a sense of where this information is coming from. And the problem is people are not challenging these things. Instead, they're sharing them. And it becomes so widespread that organizations like mine and like Bruce's and like Pia's are trying to play catch up to make sure people are thinking critically first to not become part of that problem. So I have these great examples in my own house that help me get these examples. I'm trying to train them, as Bruce was alluding to just think a little bit before you take action. And I think that'll go a long way.
And all of it leading back to news literacy, which is where we're going next with this show. But we're out of time for today. So I'd like to thank Jonathan Forsythe of Tegna's VERIFY, Pia Blumenthal of Adobe, and Bruce MacCormack of Project Origin for this conversation. Thank you for watching. You can watch past episodes of Inside the Media on our Facebook and YouTube pages. See you next time, where we'll take another look at how the media works.